He sat in the same chair every morning, same thermos, same silence. For 3 years, Marines walked past the old security guard at Gate 7 without a second glance, just another civilian doing his job. Until one recruit noticed something that made his blood freeze, a faded tattoo on the man's wrist that only one kind of warrior earns. Welcome to Everyday Legends. Before we continue this powerful story, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. These stories matter, because sometimes the greatest heroes sit in the quietest corners. Gate 7 at Marine Corps Base Quantico began the same way every morning. Before dawn broke, as the first vehicle entered the parking area, the light in the small security booth was already on. Inside sat 69-year-old Frank Morrison, his graying hair always combed the same way, his face wearing the same calm expression, a metallic thermos in his hand. Frank Morrison had been working here for 3 years, first part-time, then full-time. Hired as a security guard at the Marine base, he checked IDs, kept entry logs, and directed visitors. Quiet, reliable, trouble-free employee. Never took time off, never called in sick, never arrived late. Perfect work record. But not much else was known about Frank. It was known he had been married, widowed, actually. His wife Margaret had died of cancer 10 years earlier. No children. He lived alone in a small house 30 minutes from Quantico. The neighbors liked him, polite, helpful, never caused any problems. But they knew nothing about Frank's past, either. Every morning at 5:45, Frank would arrive at the base in his old Ford pickup. He'd park in the same spot, walk to the security booth, place his thermos coffee on the desk, and begin the first shift of the day. On his desk were a few personal items, a black and white photo of Margaret, a picture of their dog Rex, and a small radio. Nothing else. No medals, no plaques, no hints of his military past. The young Marines knew Frank simply as Old Frank. Polite, quiet, someone who knew his job. But none of them engaged in long conversations with him. Frank wasn't talkative anyway. Good morning. Have a good day. Thank you. His vocabulary was limited to these phrases. He never asked questions, never made comments, just did his job. Some young Marines would joke about Frank, especially the new arrivals. Old Frank probably never wore a military uniform, they'd say. Maybe he's scared of war movies. They'd laugh and move on. Even if Frank heard this, he never reacted. He'd just sip his thermos coffee and continue with his paperwork. But Frank's past was far more complex than they could imagine. In 1968, Frank Morrison was a 21-year-old young man, a fresh Marine, just finished boot camp, receiving advanced training before being sent to Vietnam. Back then, he was tall, athletic, a warrior with fire in his eyes. He'd trained as a sniper, was one of the best marksmen, and he was preparing to enter the most difficult period of his life. Khe Sanh base was hell's name in Vietnam. In 1968, it had been besieged by the North Vietnamese army, subjected to constant bombardment for 77 days. Thousands of artillery shells, rocket attacks, constant threat of death. And Frank Morrison was right in the middle of that hell. 3rd Marine Division, 2nd Battalion, Bravo Company. Frank's unit defended one of the most dangerous sectors of Khe Sanh. As a sniper, Frank's job was to identify enemy positions, neutralize threats, and protect his brothers. But what happened in those days was beyond what any training could prepare for. 10 hours of bombardment daily, constant fear of death, losing friends, and the worst of all, not knowing if you'd make it home. Frank spent 77 days at Khe Sanh, from the beginning to the end of the siege, and those 77 days completely changed him. He'd entered as a young, talkative, social Marine. He emerged as a quiet, withdrawn, traumatized warrior. When Frank returned to America in 1971, he was no longer the same person. PTSD, survivor's guilt, nightmares that came in the night, and no one understood him. Vietnam veterans weren't welcomed as heroes in those days. On the contrary, society kept its distance from them. Frank also grew silent. He didn't talk about the war. he hid his medals and tried to leave his past behind. In the years that followed, Frank worked various jobs: factory worker, truck driver, construction worker. He met Margaret, got married, tried to build a quiet life. They wanted to have children, but couldn't. Margaret knew about Frank's past, but didn't force him to talk about it. She understood and respected Frank's silence. After Margaret's death, Frank was completely alone, retired, living alone, no close relationships with anyone, until he found the security job at Quantico. Perhaps unconsciously, he wanted to be in a marine environment, to feel the energy of young warriors, to remember those days. But no one knew who Frank was, and he wasn't telling. That October morning, everything was as usual. Frank had arrived at 5:45, prepared his coffee, checked his logs. The weather had cooled. Autumn leaves were falling to the ground. A peaceful morning, a routine day. The first vehicle came at 6:30 a.m. It was food service. Frank did the ID check, allowed passage. Then a few civilian vehicles, staff cars, routine. At 8 a.m., the young Marine's shift began. First came Sergeant Patterson, someone who knew Frank, always treated him kindly. "Good morning, Frank," he said. Frank replied, "Good morning." Then came Lieutenant Rodriguez, young, ambitious, always in a hurry. He handed over his ID card, said, "Thanks, Frank," and passed through. Next came Lieutenant Jake Morrison, 26 years old, stationed at Quantico for 3 years. He knew Frank, always behaved respectfully. But that morning, there was something different about Jake. A bit distracted, a bit thoughtful. As Jake handed over his ID card, he said, "Good morning, Frank." "Good morning," Frank replied, checking the card. As he handed the card back, Frank's hand touched Jake's. And at that moment, Frank's shirt sleeve slid up slightly. Just for a second, maybe less. But Jake's eyes were sharp, and what he noticed in that brief moment completely shook him. On Frank's left wrist, faded almost to the point of being pale but unmistakable, was a tattoo. Eagle, globe, and anchor. The United States Marine Corps emblem. Old, weathered, sun-faded, but definitely real. Jake froze. He forgot to take his ID card. His eyes locked onto Frank's wrist. But Frank, noticing Jake's stare, quickly pulled his arm back and pulled his shirt sleeve down. "Your ID card," said Frank, no change in his voice. Calm, neutral, as always. Jake's hand trembled as he took the card. Thank you," he stammered. But his mind was confused, his heart racing. Was what he saw real? Could the old quiet security guard Frank have a Marine tattoo? After parking his car, Jake sat frozen in place. His mind was full of 1,000 questions. Was Frank a Marine? When had he served? Where had he been? And most importantly, why had he never mentioned it? Throughout that day, Jake couldn't concentrate on his work. During training, in meetings, during lunch breaks, everywhere his mind was on Frank. Was that tattoo he saw real, or had he imagined it? During his lunch break, Jake started researching on the internet. Marine Corps tattoos, Eagle globe anchor, Vietnam-era tattoos. The pictures he found matched exactly what he'd seen on Frank's wrist. Old style, simple design, no color at all. The characteristic Marine tattoo of the 60s and 70s. When the evening shift began, Jake went back to Gate 7. Frank was still there, sitting quietly in the final hours of the day. Soft music was coming from the radio. Frank was organizing his records. Jake got out of his car and walked to the gate. His heart was pounding. He didn't know how to ask. "Frank," he said, trying to keep his voice soft. Frank looked up. "Yes, Lieutenant Morrison?" Jake hesitated. The fact that they shared the same last name always made them both smile. But now Jake had other things on his mind. "Frank, this morning," he stopped. He didn't know how to ask. "What happened?" asked Frank, genuinely curious. Were you a Marine?" After he asked the question, heavy silence fell. Frank's face changed. His calm expression disappeared, replaced by a careful, wary look. "Why are you asking?" said Frank, his voice slightly hardening. "Because this morning, on your wrist, what I saw." Frank understood. He instinctively looked at his arm, then at Jake. "You didn't see anything," he said. His voice wasn't harsh, just definitive. But Jake didn't give up. He felt he was very close. "Frank, please, I just want to know." Frank took a sip from his thermos coffee. He remained silent for a long time. Jake waited. He didn't push, just waited. Finally, Frank spoke. "A long time ago," he said. "A very long time ago." Jake's heart raced. "When? Where?" Frank looked at him. Really looked. His eyes met Jake's, and at that moment the young lieutenant felt the weight of what he was seeing. These weren't the eyes of an ordinary man. These were the eyes of someone who had seen much, experienced much, lost much. "Vietnam," Frank said finally, 1968 to 1971. Jake's breath caught. Vietnam. That legendary war. His generation only knew it from movies, from books. But sitting across from him was a real veteran of that war. "Which unit?" asked Jake, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. Frank remained silent for a long time. Answering this question wasn't easy, because naming his unit meant saying where he'd been, and that meant telling his story. "3rd Marine Division," he said finally. 2nd Battalion, Bravo Company. Jake didn't know much about these units, but he sensed Frank had something more to say. "We were at Khe Sanh," said Frank, his voice almost inaudibly low. Jake's world stopped. Khe Sanh. Every Marine knew that name, one of the most horrific battles of the Vietnam War. A 77-day siege, thousands of casualties. And Frank was there. "You ... Jake's voice wouldn't come. "You were really at Khe Sanh," Frank nodded. 77 days from beginning to end. Jake stood there, feeling the weight of the old man's words. For 3 years, every day, he'd been passing by a Vietnam veteran, not just any Vietnam veteran, but a Khe Sanh survivor, a real hero of one of the most terrible wars, and none of them knew it. "Frank," said Jake, his voice completely changed now, Why did you never mention it?" Frank looked at him with a bitter smile. "What would I say, Jake? War stories? Heroic tales?" He shook his head. "Should I tell you what we did there, what we witnessed, who we lost? But you're a hero." "No," said Frank, his voice hardening. "I'm not a hero. I'm just lucky. Lucky and a survivor." Jake tried to understand. "But you fought for your country. You served." "Yes, I did. And it changed me. Permanently changed me." Frank looked out the window. "Some things aren't spoken, Jake. Some things are carried inside. And sometimes that's the best way." "Does anyone else know?" asked Jake. "My wife knew. Margaret. But she's dead too." Frank's voice was breaking. "No one else." Jake's heart ached. Frank had been carrying this secret alone for over 30 years. He'd never shared it with anyone, never told anyone. "Frank, what did you do there? What was your rank?" Frank looked at him carefully. Answering this question meant opening up an even deeper story. "I was a sergeant," he said finally. "Sniper sergeant." Jake's eyes widened. Sniper. Being a sniper in Vietnam was one of the most dangerous, most stressful jobs. Being alone, waiting for hours, neutralizing enemy targets, and living with constant risk of death. "How many?" Jake wanted to ask the question, but stopped. "Don't ask," said Frank, understanding what Jake was thinking. "Numbers don't matter. What matters is doing your job and coming home. I came home. Many of my friends didn't." Jake nodded. "Do you have medals?" A shadow passed over Frank's face. "At home, in a box. I don't look at them. Because those medals remind me of things I don't want to remember, things I had to do, people I lost." Jake was beginning to understand. Frank's silence was self-protection. He'd experienced very heavy things, lost too much, and the way to cope with it had become silence. That week, Jake watched Frank with different eyes. The man's posture, his stance, his way of moving. Now he understood. There was still military discipline in every movement of Frank's. shoulders straight, back upright, every movement controlled and purposeful. This was the posture of a man shaped by the battlefield. Jake began observing Frank's daily routine. He came at 5:45 in the morning, exactly on time. He prepared his coffee, organized his workspace, did his paperwork meticulously. He didn't miss any detail, did everything by the book. Military precision, and Frank's interaction with Marines. Jake now noticed that Frank showed the same respect to every Marine, regardless of rank, age, or attitude. Equal respect, equal professionalism. One day, a young Marine was slightly disrespectful to Frank. He was in a rush, threw his ID card, said, "Hurry up, old man." Jake was about to get angry, but he saw Frank's reaction. He didn't get upset at all. He just took the card, checked it, handed it back, said, "Have a good day." Same professionalism, same courtesy. Jake later cornered that young Marine. "Dude, did you see how you treated Frank?" The Marine shrugged. "What happened?" "I was just in a hurry." "You need to show Frank respect." "Why?" "He's just a security guard." Jake stopped. Should he continue this conversation? Should he reveal Frank's secret? Or should he respect Frank's wishes? "Because people deserve respect," he said finally, "with or without a title." That evening, Jake had another conversation with Frank. "Frank, something happened today." "What happened?" Jake told him about the interaction with the young Marine. Frank listened, made no comment. "Jake," he said finally, "that's normal. Young people sometimes get impatient. That doesn't make them bad people. But he was disrespectful to you." "Numbery?" "He was just in a hurry. Disrespect and impatience aren't the same thing." Jake was amazed by Frank's wisdom, the man's perspective, his understanding. This came from years of experience, life experience, military experience, hardship experience. "Frank," said Jake, "you really are my mentor." Frank smiled. "Jake, you don't need a title to be a mentor. I'm already your mentor, every day, quietly." Jake understood. Frank was mentoring by example, with his discipline, his professionalism, his humility. Words weren't needed. Friday, some of Jake's unit buddies were passing through Gate 7. They too barely noticed Frank as usual, but Jake couldn't stand it anymore. "Guys," said Jake, "meet Frank." The other Marines stopped. "Sure," said one. "Hi, Frank." "No," said Jake. "Really meet him. Frank Morrison, Vietnam veteran, Khe Sanh survivor, sniper." Silence fell. The Marines looked at Frank, now with different eyes. Frank gave Jake an angry look. "This wasn't necessary," said Frank, but it was too late. Word began to spread. That evening, several sergeants came to Frank's booth. They asked questions, wanted to hear stories. Frank was reluctant, but finally told a few things. He didn't give much detail, but enough. By the weekend, everyone on base knew who Frank was. But strangely, nothing had changed. Frank still sat in the same chair, still drank from the same thermos, still did his job with the same silence. The only thing that changed was how the Marines looked at him. He was no longer just security guard Frank. Now he was Sergeant Morrison, Vietnam veteran, Khe Sanh survivor, silent hero Frank. Monday morning when Jake came to Gate 7, he saw something new on Frank's desk. A small American flag in the corner of the desk, and on Frank's shirt collar, very small but visible, was a Marine pin. "Frank," said Jake. "The flag?" Frank smiled. For the first time, a real smile. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe I don't have to leave the past completely in the past." Jake nodded. "Maybe old Marines have things to give to young Marines." "Maybe," said Frank, but quietly, always quietly. And so Frank Morrison, the man who had been invisible for 3 years, began to become visible, but still quietly, humbly, without any exaggeration. Because that's how real heroes behave. They don't make noise, don't show off. They're just there, quietly, always ready. A few months later, a visitor came to Frank's booth, an elderly man, a retired general. He had recognized Frank. They had been in the same area in Vietnam, and the general knew Frank's story. "Sergeant Morrison," said the general, "it's an honor to see you." Frank stood up, saluted. "General, I know you live quietly here, but I want you to know you and what you did haven't been forgotten. They never will be." Frank nodded. "Thank you, sir." The general left, but something changed in Frank's life. He was no longer just a survivor. He was remembered, respected, valued. Jake saw Frank as just a security guard for the last time that day. From then on, he would always be Sergeant Frank Morrison, silent hero, Vietnam veteran, invisible warrior. Months passed. Frank's story became a legend within the base, but Frank never changed. Still the same humility, same silence, same professionalism. Young Marines began showing him different respect, not just as a security guard, but as a master. And sometimes, young Marines would come to Frank seeking advice. Frank didn't talk much, but with concise sentences, words carrying deep meaning, he would guide them. "Sergeant Morrison," a young Marine would say, "what was the hardest thing about war?" Frank would think for a long time, then answer, "The hardest thing was coming home." And then getting used to that home, or, "How do you stay so strong?" It's not about being strong, it's about staying standing, every day one more step. These words would settle in the minds of young warriors, knowledge they couldn't find in books they learned from Frank's quiet presence. A year later, Jake was promoted. He was now Captain Jake Morrison. But every morning, he still passed through Gate 7, greeted Frank. This had become more than a routine. It had become a show of respect. "Sergeant Morrison," Jake would say, "good morning." "Good morning, Captain," Frank would say, but smiling. A special bond had formed between them, the bond between mentor and student. That summer, a new group of young Marines arrived at the base, fresh graduates full of energy, big dreams. And of course, when they first saw Frank, they repeated the old prejudices. "Who's that old man?" one asked Jake. "That's Sergeant Frank Morrison," said Jake proudly. "Vietnam veteran, Khe Sanh survivor, and probably the most honorable man you'll ever meet." The young Marine was surprised. "Really?" "Really, and if you want to learn something from him, just be respectful and wait. He knows what he'll tell you." This new group also in time understood Frank's value, and the cycle continued. Every new Marine learned who Frank was, learned to show respect, and received life lessons from him. When Frank's 72nd birthday came, the Marines on base prepared a small surprise for him. Not a big celebration, just a cake and a few friends. Frank was very moved. He hadn't experienced something like this in years. "Thank you, boys," he said, his voice trembling. "But this wasn't necessary." "It was, Frank," said Jake, "because you're our family." That night as Frank drove home, sitting alone in his car, he tried to control his tears. After Margaret's death, he had felt completely alone. But now he understood that he hadn't been cut off from his family. He had just found a different family. Frank's story began to spread outside the base, too. The local newspaper offered him a small interview. Frank initially refused, but accepted after Jake's insistence. The interview was very modest. Frank didn't give much detail, but people were still impressed. "I don't tell war stories," he had said in the interview, "because war isn't a story, it's lived reality. And some realities should stay only inside those who lived them." These words deeply affected many people who read the newspaper, especially other veterans. They too, like Frank, were living quietly, carrying their pasts inside them. And Frank's example gave them hope too. Months passed. Frank was aging. Small problems started with his health, heart problems, his knees hurt, his eyes didn't see as well as before. But he was determined to continue working. One morning, Frank came to Gate 7 as usual, but was a bit different, moving slower, resting more often. Jake noticed. "Frank, are you okay?" "I'm fine, Jake. Just getting old." "Maybe you should take a break. Rest." Frank looked at him. "Jake, this job is my life. If I leave here, what will I do?" Jake understood. For Frank, this wasn't just a job. It was purpose, identity, family connection. "Okay, Frank, but be careful. And if you need help, we're here." Frank smiled. "I know, Jake. Thank you." That winter, Frank's health condition worsened a bit more. The doctor advised him to stop working. Frank stubbornly refused. "Sergeant Morrison," said the doctor, "you're a strong man, but your body needs rest." "Doctor," said Frank, "I learned to rest in Vietnam 50 years ago. Now it's too late." But the body, despite everything, had its limits. One January morning, when Frank came to Gate 7, he looked very tired. While drinking his coffee, his hand was shaking. When Jake arrived, he saw Frank's condition. "Frank, go home today. Rest." "No, Jake, I have work." "Frank, please, just one day." Frank looked at him. He saw the worry in Jake's eyes and understood that this wasn't just worry, it was love. "Okay," said Frank, "but just today." That day, Frank rested at home, but in the evening he called Jake. "Jake, am I coming tomorrow?" "Of course, Frank. We're waiting for you." But the next morning, Frank didn't come. Jake was worried. At noon, he called Frank's house. The phone didn't answer. Jake, along with a few Marines, went to Frank's house. The neighbors opened the door. Frank was in the hospital. He'd had a heart attack. At the hospital, Frank was in intensive care. Jake and the other Marines sat in the waiting room, waiting for news. When the doctor came out, he said, "His condition is stable, but considering his age, the recovery process will be long." When Jake went inside, Frank was awake. He looked weak, but his eyes were still bright. "Jake," said Frank, "when can I return to work?" Jake smiled, a typical Frank question. "Frank, just focus on getting better now." "But the gate, who's watching?" "Don't worry, we're handling it." Frank was uncomfortable. "But Frank," said Jake, putting his hand on his shoulder, "you've given us so much. Now it's time for us to give to you." Frank's eyes filled with tears. "Jake, I just did my job." "No, Frank, you became our family." Frank stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. During this time, Gate 7 became like a monument dedicated to him. Marines constantly came to visit. Flowers, cards, small gifts. Frank was very touched. "This much attention isn't necessary," he kept saying. "It is, Frank," Jake would say, "because you're important to us." When Frank got out of the hospital, the doctor recommended complete rest. He needed not to work for at least 3 months. "3 months?" said Frank. "What will I do for 3 months?" "You'll get better, Frank, and we'll wait for you." Those 3 months were very hard for Frank, sitting at home, doing nothing, having no purpose. He became depressed. Jake noticed this and started making regular visits to him. "Frank, how are you?" "Bad, Jake. I feel useless." "Frank, you're valuable for every day you live. You don't have to work." "But who am I, Jake? If I'm not working, who am I?" This was a deep question. Frank's identity had been integrated with his work for years. Jake thought. "Frank, do you know who you are? You're our master, our mentor, our family elder, and you don't need to work for that." These words affected Frank. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe his identity wasn't just about his job. After 3 months, Frank got approval from the hospital. But the doctor warned he can't work full days, maximum half days. Frank accepted these conditions because at least he was returning. On his first day back, a surprise awaited him at Gate 7. The Marines had hung a small "Welcome Back" banner. And on his desk was a new photo, a group photo of all base personnel. Written underneath, "The heart of our family, Sergeant Frank Morrison." Frank was so moved he couldn't speak. He just sat and cried, tears of happiness. "Welcome back, Frank," said Jake. "It's good to be home," said Frank. And so Frank Morrison, in the final period of his life, returned not just to a job, but to a family. In his old age, he wasn't alone. He was loved, valued, remembered. Now he worked half days, but his impact was greater than full days, because everyone knew his value. And Frank, with his quiet presence, continued to give young Marines life's most important lessons. And sometimes, the most powerful stories are lived by the quietest people. They don't make noise, don't put on shows. They just come every day, do their jobs, and quietly carry history. Frank Morrison was such a person, and now, finally, everyone knew it. So have you ever met someone like this? Someone who lived quietly, never told their story, but carried an entire war inside them? Share their names in the comments, because here at Everyday Legends, the stories of silent heroes are also heard. If this story touched you, subscribe and share. Because people like Frank Morrison shouldn't be forgotten. Their silence should become our voice. See you in the next story. And remember, sometimes the greatest heroes sit in the quietest corners.